That night I'm going to tell you about, my girlfriend and I arrived in Portland. We had been planning for a while to visit the local forests and spend the night there in a tent. We love hiking, and we have good gear. Tent, gas burners, sleeping bags, and a lot more. The forecast said there would be light rain that day, but who could have known that as soon as we set up camp, a real storm would begin. But let me start from the beginning. We arrived and checked into a motel. We weren't planning to stay there. It was just a place to leave the things we wouldn't need in the forest. At 4 p.m., we headed out. The forests here are incredibly beautiful and atmospheric. There are many streams, cliffs, and stunning trees. We started our hike in the evening, and I could already smell the rain coming, but there was nothing to worry about. We were on a popular tourist trail, and a bit of rain wasn't going to be a problem. The trail was filled with the amazing atmosphere of nature, of life. But with the first rumble of thunder, the mood changed. It became heavy, and it felt like something was rushing us. I clearly remember feeling like we were late for something. But for what? Then the rain started, but it wasn't light. It was a full-on downpour with strong winds. We realized we wouldn't be able to set up the tent in these conditions, but turning back was dangerous. We had come too far. Our only option was to keep moving forward and reach an old hunter's cabin before dark. I knew about this place. I told Alice we'd make it, but I couldn't say exactly where the cabin was. I just knew its location on the map. In that weather, though, it was hard to navigate. That's when my skills and experience came in handy. After a couple of miles, we were soaked through, but we finally saw the cabin. It was very old, probably not even safe to spend the night in, but we had no choice. It was already dark. We approached the cabin and looked around. The structure was really unstable. The roof was rotting and sagging. The foundation was falling apart. It was dangerous to stay in such a place, but sleeping outside wasn't an option either. We went inside and were hit by a terrible smell. Mold, dampness, everything was wet. This house had been abandoned for a long time. Trash was scattered everywhere. We slowly walked around to inspect all the rooms. There was one large room with an old stove and a table, and one small room with 2 beds. Apparently, there had been a stove there too, but scavengers must have taken it. We decided to set up in the room with the table, but first, we needed to clean up. It was already dark outside, and we hung our camping lantern. It gave off plenty of light, and the battery should have lasted the whole night. We used an old mop that had been standing in a dirty corner covered in cobwebs. Alice cleaned the floor, and I cleared the table and prepared a spot for the tent. Yes, I thought it would be better to sleep in the tent near the window, so we wouldn't get sick from the mold smell. I set up the tent, while Alice went outside to wet a cloth and wipe the table. It took me about 5 minutes to set up the tent. It's not an easy task. During that time, when I was alone in the house, I started to feel something strange. Loneliness, hopelessness, despair. Raindrops were pounding on the old roof. Once, people used to stay here, sitting by the stove, enjoying strong coffee. Someone would tell a story about tracking a moose, and others would joke about what might happen if he ran into a bear. But now, this house is dead. There's no life here, only darkness. Where was Alice? She should have been back by now. I stepped outside and looked around. She was nowhere to be seen. I started to worry and called out for her, but she didn't answer. I stepped farther into the yard and finally saw her. She was standing a bit away, in the forest. "What are you doing here?" "Someone buried their family here." She was standing next to a grave. "Oh my God, what is that?" Alice said she had heard a voice and walked in that direction. She thought it might have been a child's voice, or maybe a bird. But then she found this. It was really creepy. We headed back to the cabin, but the door was shut. Damn! Looked like the wind had slammed it shut. The wind was so strong I could barely stay on my feet. I walked around the house and realized there was only one entrance. I'd have to use some force. I broke the lock and got the door open. We went back inside. I tied the door shut with a cord so it wouldn't swing open in the wind. We sat at the table and lit the gas burner to cook some food. First, we had to boil water. Alice started cutting vegetables and set out our camping dishes. I made coffee, and finally we were able to relax a little. The problem was, we were soaked to the bone. We took off our wet clothes and changed into spare t-shirts and shorts. Alice hung our clothes above the gas burner so they could dry at least a little overnight. We climbed into the tent and set up another gas burner inside. We needed to warm up a little. We got into our sleeping bags and planned to fall asleep once the air inside the tent heated up at least a bit. The rain kept falling. Lightning flashed constantly outside the window. It was hard to fall asleep in that kind of atmosphere, especially with the constant smell. But I eventually managed to sleep for about 2 hours. I woke up in the middle of the night because of a noise. I thought it was Alice waking up, but it wasn't. She was still sound asleep. I didn't want to wake her, so I decided to check out the sound myself. I was afraid the house might be falling apart, but after looking around, I realized it wasn't the house. Probably a tree or some branches had fallen on the roof. While checking the place, I noticed a hatch leading to the attic, but I couldn't open it. I went back to the tent and lay down again. Soon after, I woke up again. The front door had opened. Looked like the wind was so strong, it snapped the rope. The door was wide open, and cold air was blowing into the cabin. I grabbed another cord and went to fix the problem. It took me a few minutes, but I finally managed to close the front door. Time to head back to the tent and warm up. When I walked into the room, I saw Alice standing outside the tent, looking through the window. Her face was filled with fear and shock. "What are you doing?" I looked out the window and saw the terrifying face of an old man. He was staring at Alice from head to toe. Like an animal, he was hungrily watching her and breathing with his mouth open. I ran up and shouted at him to get lost. The man smiled and walked around the house. We couldn't sleep anymore. We had to pack up and maybe leave as soon as possible. We didn't want any trouble. Suddenly, a loud bang on the door. He was trying to break in. I ran to the door and told Alice to pack quickly and find the bear spray. I held the door with all my strength, but I knew the old wooden boards wouldn't last long. Alice brought me the spray, and I hit our chupacabra with it. He immediately ran off into the woods. We dressed quickly and left the house. It was early morning, and the rain was starting to ease up. We walked away from that creepy house and its residents. As we passed by the grave, we saw that horrifying man sitting on the ground next to it. I don't know who he was, but I'll never go camping in the rain again. What scared me most was the way that wild man looked at my wife, and the strange things that happened with that front door. I still can't shake the thought that he might have been inside with us while we slept. This story happened to me in 2016. I live in Russia, in a small, poor town, but I was born and raised in a village. This is what it looks like. There used to be a lot of people here, but now only about 10 people live in the village. They're all elderly. The house was passed down to me, and I still come here with my parents. In 2016, I came alone. I wanted to go into the forest to pick mushrooms and berries. Our house is right next to a forest that stretches on for many kilometers. I just wanted to get away from the noise of the city and enjoy nature and solitude. It was July 29th, my birthday. I didn't want a party. I simply told my friends I wanted to spend the day here. I arrived in the village that morning by bus and unlocked the front door. That smell, it reminded me of childhood. I used to come here every summer and spend hours walking around with friends. Now I was here alone. Everything was just like before, but a wave of sadness hit me. All my relatives who used to visit or live here had long since passed away. Only my parents were still alive, and they only occasionally came here to mow the grass. I went inside the house and changed into my old clothes. I had a snack, drank some tea from my favorite old mug, and then went to the shed. There, I found a basket and a few small buckets for berries. I left the house and headed into the forest. I knew all the paths and nearly every tree in these woods. This was real nature, with many types of trees, mushrooms, and berries. Almost right away, I found a raspberry bush. I ate a few berries and moved on. Today, I wasn't planning to gather raspberries. Then I found my first mushroom. In our region, this type is called a white mushroom. It's considered the rarest and tastiest. I came to the river. It was beautiful there, but full of mosquitoes. I turned around and went in the other direction. That's when I found the berry I was really looking for. Blueberries. I started picking. After a couple of hours, I had filled both buckets and went deeper into the forest. I wanted to check one more spot that might have mushrooms. I was right. By evening, I had gathered a full basket of mushrooms. It was time to go home. I wanted to visit our traditional Russian sauna, banya, and then spend the night in the house, eating fried potatoes with mushrooms. But when I approached the house, I noticed something strange. The front door was open. Honestly, I couldn't remember if I had closed it. So I just went inside and began taking off my clothes. That's something you have to do here because there are a lot of ticks in the forest. I checked my whole body and put on a different set of clothes. Then it was time to go outside and prepare firewood to heat up the banya. As I walked down the hallway, I heard a strange sound, like someone howling. It came from very far away. I was inside the house and couldn't figure out where the sound was coming from. It was getting dark quickly. I lit the stove in the banya and went behind the house where we store the firewood. Twilight. There's no outdoor lighting, no street lights, nothing. I started gathering firewood, and suddenly, those howls again. I turned around and looked toward the sound. I didn't know what it was. Jesus Christ, you scared the hell out of me. I walked over to the banya to drop off the firewood. At that moment, I noticed how cold it had suddenly gotten outside. Even in a warm sweater, I felt chilly. I went back into the house and decided to light the stove inside. I went into the boiler room, although in Russia we call it something else. We have a brick stove there that burns firewood for heating. I lit the fire and threw in a few more logs. Soon the house started to warm up. While the banya was heating, I made myself some tea with cookies. I sat by the window. It was already dark outside. The strangest thing was that in the city, because of all the buildings, it usually seems brighter at night. But at that moment, the village was lit up too. The starry sky and the moon lit everything around. I looked at the massive spruce tree across from the window, about 30 meters from the house. That tree has been standing there since before the first house in the village was built. I stared at it, thinking about my life, when suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone pass by the fence. I immediately decided to check who it was, but no one was outside. The gate was still closed. All right then, I'll go check if the banya is ready. I went inside, and it was so warm, I didn't want to go back out into the abnormal cold. I stepped outside, and right in front of me was the old shed. I noticed the door was slightly open and decided to close it. The shed used to house pigs and rabbits. Now it's just a storage place for useless junk. There isn't even a light bulb in there. It's pitch dark and smells bad. Why was the door open? As I started to close it, I heard some kind of noise coming from inside the house. I walked over to the window and looked in. Damn, someone really was walking around in there. Maybe it was the neighbors? Maybe they saw the lights on and came to visit? I slowly headed back inside, but I was already starting to feel uneasy. What if it wasn't the neighbors? I slowly walked down the long hallway, listening carefully. Silence. I turned on the light and opened the door. There was no one inside either. All right, I must have imagined it. After all, I'm not often in complete silence and isolation like this. I grabbed a towel and headed to the banya. It was a proper roasting in there. The temperature was about 100 degrees Celsius. I stepped outside completely naked to cool off and noticed that the light was on in the house. I put on clean clothes and immediately grabbed my phone. Mom, is that you walking around the house? Did you come to the village? No, we're in the city. What's going on? This definitely wasn't my imagination. I hoped it was Valentina, our neighbor. I walked up to the house and saw something terrifying in the window. It was a man with long, filthy hair and a beard. He was covered in bruises and wounds, and his wild eyes stared at me from the dark window. I froze, not knowing what to do. He was inside, and I was outside. I had nowhere to go, and the buses don't run this late. My head was filled with 1,000 thoughts. and then the man screamed. But he did it like it was some kind of roar, like an animal. As soon as his silhouette disappeared from my view, I realized he was coming toward me. I locked myself in the banya and stayed there until morning. It was unbearably hot, but I just couldn't go outside. A wild fear of that insane animalistic rage wrapped around me. When I stepped outside in the morning, it felt like a miracle. Snow had fallen. I walked to the house and saw tracks. It looked like he had left. I slowly went inside and checked every room. I was alone. I don't know who that man was or what he was doing there. Maybe he had been living there or was just looking for food. I never went to the village alone again. My name is Jeffrey. This story happened to me 2 years ago. That day I was planning to go on a camping trip. I wanted to spend the night in a tent and sit by a fire. It's my hobby. But to get to that place, I needed to drive. I used to go there with my father, and only I knew exactly where it was. I packed my things and hit the road. A few miles out of town, I noticed a man sitting on the side of the road. He was sitting directly on the ground. I stopped to see if he needed help. The man was very strange. He looked unkempt and moved like he was drunk, but there was no smell of alcohol. In fact, he barely smelled like anything at all. I asked him if he needed help, but he said nothing. "Do you need a ride?" He looked at me and stood up. He nodded and said he'd be very grateful if I gave him a lift. He got into the back seat. I felt like a taxi driver. I asked him to let me know where I should stop so he could continue on his way. He said nothing. I kept driving, wondering who this man was, what had happened to him. He looked very grim and creepy. Clearly, he hadn't had an easy life. About 15 minutes later, I was near my destination, but the man showed no signs of getting out. I told him we were almost there and I couldn't go any farther. He replied that I could drop him off wherever I wanted. He didn't care where we were going. I pulled into the parking area and stopped. "We're here," I said. The man just kept sitting there, not reacting to my words. I said again that it was time to get out, that I wouldn't be going any farther. He looked at me, and his stare was completely empty. He got out of the car and said in a hoarse voice, "See you later." He didn't say thank you. He said, "See you later." All right, I needed to get into the woods and forget that weirdo. I grabbed my gear and headed through the forest to the spot where I planned to set up camp. It was about 3 miles west. I walked for a long time, pushing through bushes and trees, and finally I got there. I sat down to rest for a bit and soon started setting up my tent. It was really hot, but I knew it would get cold at night, so I had a sleeping bag with me, and I planned to build a fire. I set up the tent quickly and immediately began gathering firewood. I made a fire and boiled water to make coffee. I wasn't planning to cook. I'd brought all my food with me. I just wanted to enjoy nature and remember the times I came here as a kid with my dad. Soon it got dark, and the light from the fire created a cozy, peaceful atmosphere in this quiet place. No problems, just me and the moment. But then I heard a noise in the woods, like someone walking toward me. I looked carefully, but couldn't see anyone. As soon as I stood up, the sound stopped, of course. All right, it was probably just a rabbit. Anyone would think that. I went into the tent, zipped it up, and pulled out a book, a bit of hot coffee, and then off to sleep. But I couldn't fall asleep. That man kept creeping into my thoughts. I kept wondering who he was, and what might have happened to him. During the night, I was lying there with my eyes closed, trying to sleep, when I heard that same sound again. Someone was walking toward my camp. It definitely wasn't an animal. It was a person, slowly approaching. I quickly grabbed my stun gun and slipped it under my pillow. I lay there, waiting for the right moment to find out who was out there. I saw a human figure. The fire was dying down, but it was still bright enough to let me see the uninvited guest. He started rummaging through the things I'd left outside. He was tossing them around, clearly looking for something. I kept watching and hoped he wouldn't try to open the tent. "Please, just don't come in here." Then he turned and started to unzip the door. I lay still, pretending to be asleep. I had the advantage. He didn't know I was aware of him. He just stood there, watching me. Once he was sure I was asleep, he turned and walked back into the woods. And then I heard a cough. In that moment, I realized who it was. I was sure it was the man I had picked up. He had been following me all day and waited until I fell asleep. What was he trying to find? Money? Why was he staring at me? And why did he leave? I have no proof it was him, but I'm absolutely sure I wasn't wrong. I stayed in the tent until morning and didn't sleep at all. I kept waiting for him to come back. I sat like that until dawn, and then headed home. I didn't see a single soul along the way.